being in community, and thinking, as I like to say on social media, thinking Black out loud in public. So no, I really appreciate any opportunity that we can share things that we know, things that we want to know, and figure out what to do moving forward is always a welcome opportunity. So,
all right. Well, James, we're going to record tonight's conversation so we can upload it later on a number of different platforms. So I wanted to make sure we have that record button on. And I'd like to invite all of the students and guests who are with us this evening. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask, you can use the chat box or the Q&A function. But you just go right through chat and we'll get those questions and incorporate those in our conversation. But James, to begin our conversation tonight, you say you're currently a scholar who is thinking about an Africana future and the forms of knowledge that conceptualize liberation by returning to the source. Tell us the journey of this Africana scholar who is doing that. How did we arrive at this particular point, or how did you arrive at this particular point?
Wow, that's a very, very good place to start. As we often say, and we can trace this with the genealogy of Black studies, Africana studies itself, and its non-institutional form, but its institutional forms as it develops as a knowledge system before institutionalized, but also as it becomes institutionalized, is that it was pretty much probably like everybody else's. I started out, with questions, growing up in communities where police we called them, AKA quote unquote, jump out boys. So they're constantly, harassing us in the neighborhoods. I grew up between Richmond, Virginia and Philadelphia, kind of going back and forth. And so I think it was a non-traditional way because I thought I was going to be a lawyer at one time, and because I thought that being able to be a lawyer and protect my friends and folk that I saw, being ensnared into the criminal, as I call it, the justice system that creates criminals. I thought that they needed representation. I thought that they needed someone such as myself or folk who understood. But there was a number of things that happened as I was moving and matriculating through education, through formal education, through university and things. And I met some people, but also just to give a little bit more texture, and probably we can unfold this as we go along, is that I come from an environment where I was exposed to organizing at a very, very early age. There were folk in the community who were, as I like to say, interested in starting revolution around the world. And so they were dealing with a lot of particular non-institutional forms of knowledge. They were studying, they had study groups. Now I must say, the only thing that I wanted to do, growing up at a certain point was to play basketballs, because I didn't understand why, these group of folk were so upset, because to me, life was fine, right? Everything. Now, mind you, I just said, this is the contradictions we deal with, right? Mind you, I just said that there was police presence highly in the communities I lived in. We lived amongst poverty. We, all of those particular things. But at the same time, in my mindset, my mind as I'm growing up, this younger part is like, things seem to be okay. But I knew that they weren't. And so I grew up around books. One of the things that my mom would do is any question that I had, if she didn't know, which was pretty much 99% of the time, because there's a lot of things she did, she just never said, hey, I didn't know, or she would point me in a direction. But one of the things that she would do is buy books or point me into the direction of books. And so I fell in love pretty early, even though I'm growing up, even though I'm playing basketball, even though I'm still quote unquote part of certain communities or certain lines or trends in our communities. I still liked books, and I remember the first time getting Souls of Black Folk, tattered copy from, and I was just I was just fascinated by it. Now, mind you, I didn't understand much of it, but I knew I needed to have it. I knew it was something that I needed to have there. And so as I started to kind of like formulate that, but one of the questions that actually led to where my work is now was centered on understanding the sustainability of movements. Because as I started to become older, teenage years, and I'm very, very heavily influenced by jazz and hip hop, of course. And I'm listening, I'm experiencing, I'm playing basketball all over the East Coast. And I'm looking at these things, going into communities, going into sometimes communities that my friends can go in, but because I was pretty good at basketball, people allowed me, to have that passport. So I was able to see, different things. But one of the things that I did notice, hearing, these stories of the communities of activists and organizers I kind of came in contact with, is that they were always talking about, movement. They were always talking about the institutionalization of movements. As I began to, get further and further, most of these folk were either a part of movements, whether it was a Black Studies movement moving on campus, or they were trying to engage in African liberation, understanding African liberation struggles and how they relate to the struggles of us here in the United States. So just to kind of cut a little bit short, and maybe we can kind of unpack this a little bit more, but I really had an internationalist view literally from almost birth, from that particular moment. And then I've always carried that understanding that there's always a greater community within which we all belong. And I also knew that the issues, just by nature of, again, growing up about activists and organizers, when they would travel, they would come back and share these stories. They would come back and share a lot of information and things that they were doing that really, really intrigued me. They talked about young folk that they visited in other places that was experiencing some of the same issues that I was experiencing. And so again, as I started to kind of really, really formulate my my journey, I gravitated towards Black Studies courses in undergrad. I went to undergrad at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia, at a time where they did not have a specific Africana studies or African American studies, but they did have the classes. I was trained and had a very, very close relationship with Dr. Audrey Smetley, one of the most foremost scholars on race, who also worked with Cedric Robinson. And so having those particular groundings and having those types of exposures really, really kind of helped me to kind of fashion my journey to kind of be where I am at this particular point, really trying to figure out and study how do we move, as Kwame Ture argues, how do we move a unconscious to conscious behavior? How do we move from a consciousness to a critical consciousness? And so I'm spending, the rest of my life trying to engage in that question.
Here you are, this renegade basketball player at Virginia Commonwealth University, growing up in a culture of books, growing up where questions are welcomed and you're supplying them in abundance, and growing up in a context where study, engagement, question raising about the world and human existence is de rigueur. It's the everyday. What makes you pursue a PhD in political science at Howard? And then how do we get to moving from that PhD to Black studies?
Well, that's a great question, Corey. And tongue in cheek, how I ended up at Howard studying political science. I often like to say I blame Dr. Clarence Hussein on that. Dr. Clarence Hussein, who is a preeminent scholar in political science and Black politics. Having knew him before, having contact with, a lot of the folk that he was engaged with, and having direct relationships with many of those particular folk. It was interesting is that I decided, because one would think, because history, I loved history growing up. History was my thing. I would read, watch, engage. If it's a history, and particularly African or Black or something in the context of some historical content that had to do with the African world, I was on it. And so one would think, those who knew me would think that I probably wouldn't have got my PhD in history. But the problem with that is that, it's funny as you say, this renegade basketball player, is that honestly, it was almost like that. I didn't like the way history was being taught. So even at that particular point, I was like, well, and I was always intrigued and wanted to understand this thing called politics. So I kind of move off of critical engagement. And so, for me, politics growing up was very different. Politics was, and so it was actually kind of like an aversion to politics. My attempt to understand the political led me to getting a PhD in political science. Now, with that being said, is that how did I end up, even going on a job market after my PhD? I didn't get one offer a look from political science because it was centered on what my work was engaged with. And one of the things that, and I kind of unwrapped this a little bit more, is that, I did Black politics, comparative politics, and international relations as my focus areas. But I did not want to study Black folk as objects. I wanted to study, again, coming from this environment of seeing folk attempting to actualize some type of a control over their communities, a control over their lives, or some type of self-determination, as we say. One of the things that I wanted to study is us as active agents. And so kind of growing up and understanding, for me, the most articulate expression of one's humanity or a people's humanity is found in the way that they resist. And so I wanted to study the ways that we resisted, not acquiesced to forces, institutions, and systems of power, and everything from the Maroons and everything from in between and back and forth to this particular point. We've always resisted. We always, and so for me, that simultaneously, I wanted to understand an African humanity. I wanted to understand, why is it that, you're going through school and, you're in education, pretty much what most students, all of our students, we taught together, all of our students and students are gravitating towards, Africana studies because they want to know. There's something ancestral and historical driving students to want to know. Now, the decisions that they make, of course, are based upon market, based upon whatever, but there's still this wanting. There are some of us who want to engage in that wanting, or want to engage into turning that want to know into a form, how to produce knowledge about these particular things that last from generation to generation. So, so I mean, in that particular context, that is pretty much what led me to that. And so I actually studied, and then the second thing to that is that I was very interested in human rights. This question around human rights goes back to the question that I had as a child: why are these problems growing? And so hearing human rights at a very early age, or hearing this, and not really understanding what it was, even though we have a sense of it, right? We have a sense that there's this something there called human rights that should trump, as Malcolm would say, the rights of civil or political rights. Malcolm's just, we often say we need to focus on human rights. So me understanding that, but also now that I'm talking out loud and thinking about this, the folk I was in, that informed me obviously had heard Malcolm. So now I'm thinking about this. Thanks, Corey. You actually making me think about why. So they implanted that in me, obviously. It was like by osmosis, these conversations. They never really said Malcolm said it, But they always understood. It was almost like they're picking up the baton and understanding where he was moving to and what he was doing. And so as I started to go, now again, partially my fault because again, I'm focused on basketball. At one point, I was going to the NBA, and that quickly went out the window. So, but one thing, again, as my family and my sisters, they would say, well, what you going to do if when basketball is done? So that was instilled in me very early. So I had a plan, moving forward. So yeah, so studying politics, that's that questions, right? So to summarize this, the question of inequality at a very structural level. How were we resisting? Because at that moment, I didn't see that we were resisting in mass, or there was no mass character in resistance, although we knew that our history is replete with forms of resistance, and whether it was mass or not, that's still, the mass character, of course, is important. That led me to the politics, that led me to understanding that, this question of politics in the context of an Africana frame of reference. And so that's what I set out to do, study social movements, particularly Africana social movements, its many manifestations as critiques of this human rights theory and practice. And so with that, by nature and by necessity, I had to use multiple forms of what is considered to be interdisciplinary. And of course, Africana studies, my work fits neatly and directly into the academy that way, as in Africana studies. And so it was just a kind of a perfect marriage that was born, as I see now, in a seed that was planted when I was thinking that everything was fine and I'm just wanted to play basketball. So yeah.
Well, you've taught at Georgetown, at Howard, Virginia Commonwealth, and now at Winston-Salem State University. In your journeys in the academy, the formation of this question-raising basketball star who is preoccupied with a culture of books as well as a culture of Africana engagement, now finds himself in the academy, teaching Africana studies at very differently located and differently situated institutions: Georgetown, Howard, Virginia Commonwealth, and Winston-Salem State. Moving across these different formations, the PhD in political science that really morphs into an Africana studies scholar. Talk to us about your conception of Black studies and how that has shifted and changed over those institutional locations.
Wow, that's very interesting. Wow, you're making me think. You're making me think. That's very interesting because, okay, so I guess I can answer this question in two ways, and I also wanted to add to this formation of my intellectual project is that I was, by nature of basketball, it provided an opportunity for me to be in many communities. And one of the things that I found is that wherever Africana people gather, there is an intrinsic level of knowledge and information that's exchanged. And what I mean is that there were people I played basketball with that I didn't even know that they actually were students who studied Africana studies. And in between games, we're actually talking about all of these particular issues, right? There were folk that were in the communities that were engaged in certain organizational activities, and they play basketball. And that was one of the places that, as we often say, is in between those lines, everything becomes, based upon what your skill level. Your PhDs fall out the way, whatever books you wrote don't mean anything because, once you're on that court, you have to show up in whatever fashion or form that you do. So I'm saying that for a reason, because having that particular exposure, also having a direct and personal relationship with folk who were organizing on global level. And also the experiences that I've had in organizing myself and working in institutions such as Trans-Africa Forum, and what was called Trans-Africa Forum, and other institutions, and organizing myself, is that one of the things that which let me back up for a second, in those organizations that I worked at, those community organizations, led to me actually, being on the radio, having a radio program, which, people go to school for, and I appreciate it. And I try to take care of my time and my airtime, because I know people get PhDs and want to be in this particular space, that being able to have a public voice. So I do take care in doing that. One of the things that I brought with me was my desire to make sure that I bring a level of balance between making sure that every student that I engage with them first on a human level, right? And then also understood that the way that I have to teach has to be almost just like organizing. Which means this: as an organizer, the first thing that you have to understand, organizing one-on-one, is understand who your audience is. So what ends up happening is that I approached it almost like I was organizing. So the content didn't change, but those particular different institutions, some of them more freer than others, and we can talk about that a little bit intellectually, but I approached it based upon really getting to know my students and just provoking questions in them, provoking them to think deeply about their own political projects, their own journeys, to them being in the space with me. So one of the things that I do is that I don't have a sense that it is this teacher student relationship. I try to really, as you know, and I'm going to say something that's very familiar to you, create ideas labs. I try to create spaces where we're engaged in ideas, and then we filter those understandings and analysis through content. So what that allowed me to do is to move from Howard to Georgetown to Virginia Commonwealth, because each of those students, although the institutional formation may have access to resources, may have opportunities at varying degrees and levels, is that our students that come to these institutions are still coming from the same place that we've come from, as I explained, like, these communities that either they come directly from them, or they know or have family members who live in those communities. So they were becoming adjacent to those particular experiences. Because of course we know that there are students who do not live in quote unquote hood, but there's still by nature a relationship there, because there's friends, and there's all of these particular formations and institutional family formations that we engage in. And so for me, what really has to change is my relationship to the institution, as opposed to Africana studies itself. I hope that makes sense. So it's really the institution that I'm in that kind of I have to navigate in the context of Africana studies, because of course we know the history, we still know the struggles and the challenges of Africana studies in an institutional form, whether it's HBCUs or whether it's predominantly white universities. There still are certain questions that must be addressed, but for me, it's really the institution. And fortunately, the institution that I'm in from, Georgetown was wonderful. Of course, it was kind of like, teach this, and it was during the summer, so like teach this, and that was it. I was able to go in the classroom. I had full reign, and things were wonderful. Virginia Commonwealth was there, the same. So it's really the institution and how much they are supporting and Africana studies as an intellectual project that really is the thing that for me that is the most challenging.
So you talk to us about the students don't change. Students raise questions. You encourage questions. You evade these hierarchical relationships between the absolute teacher and the absolute student, to begin to look at knowledge production and reproduction in a very much an egalitarian manner. The institutional context does change. You know, a Jesuit private institution, a private historically Black institution, and a public state-supported institution. Those institutional locations change, but the intellectual project doesn't. Talk to us a bit about how you understand the intellectual project of Africana Studies and the importance of that intellectual project.
Oh man, these huge questions. How long we got? Like, how I understand it is in two ways. And again, I don't think that it's too much different than most of us, but also it's development. When we talk about Africana Studies being an intellectual or insurrectionary intellectual project, that means a lot. So when we think about Africana Studies as being a form of knowledge that is born out of the experiences of Africana people wherever they are found and how they collected and stored and disseminated information, for me, it's a question of access. It's a question of, so I understand that, the project of Africana Studies is really to disrupt the relationship between power, knowledge production, and access. The things that we're doing, what we're doing tonight is a form of disrupting how we have access to people who are thinking in certain streams and certain thought processes, whether it's in a very intellectual institutional formation or very intellectual non-institutional formation. Because I don't want to make the distinction between, I want to make sure that we understand, this notion of an organic intellectual. We are intellectuals, whether we're institutional or not. Some of us may be able to use, certain language and concepts to frame our experiences, but that doesn't negate us experiencing those things, right? So for me, it's really centered around what young students and young folk, whether they were on a continent, because a lot of times when we think about Africana Studies, we think about it as an insurrectionary intellectual project. We often leave Africa out of it because students were organizing, in different contexts, of course, anti-colonial. Most of them were being, educated and radicalized at HBCUs and in Europe as they're moving around and going back to free or have anti-colonialist movements. But again, those were students. And they're having conversations and they're coming into contact with students who are engaged in struggle against, this notion of knowledge production as being institutionalized in the academy. African forms of knowledge are African indigenous forms, Africana indigenous forms of knowledge, really by nature buck against those institutionalization, because institutionalizations can often do prevent access, and so I just had this conversation on the radio program last week, is that I've read some of the most beautiful and most important journal articles, but they're behind paywalls, right? Are there, and so I'm like, man, like this needs to get to our community. This needs to get to folk, because folk are thinking exactly what this person is writing in the academy to get tenure or to make their space in the academy, which also is very antagonistic to Africana forms of knowledge systems, often devaluing it, often creating barriers for any type of advancement and delegitimizing it. I mean, this question of legitimization becomes important. So that's the reason why I say that for me, the project of Africana Studies is a both and. It is institutional and non-institutional at the same time, because it is a question of power, knowledge production, and having access to that knowledge.
So when you speak of Africana studies and access and the ways in which Africana studies create space, make space for individuals to have this radical exchange of ideas, both within the academy and beyond the academy, grounded in those knowledge, traditions, formations of Africa, both on the continent and in the diaspora. You're actively involved in disseminating that knowledge broadly through your radio programs, both on Pacifica Radio in DC and the NPR affiliate in Winston-Salem. Talk to us about how those radio programs are influenced by your perspective on Africana studies and how it becomes an extension of your Africana studies practice.
Wow. Thank you for that question, because this goes back to this legitimacy question, because it's a lot of times people will look at it and say, oh, it's just a radio program, blah, blah, blah. But no, I one of the things that me and the group of folk who work with me on it were very intent on doing is making it an educational space, was disrupting these visible and invisible are seen and unseen walls between, again, how do we have access to folk who are thinking about things that everybody is thinking about? Now, most of us, now when we talk about community, we often have a very rudimentary and limited sense of what the community is, right? So the community is all of us with varying levels of degrees of interest, but everybody's interested in their freedom. Everybody's interested in their liberation. So, those programs were intentionally built two ways. I wanted to make sure that it was legitimate in the context of what is considered to be academia. So we've published. We made sure that the programs were rich with resources, rich with conversation, and centered around different aspects that Africana studies have been dealing with consistently, such as justice, such as this notion of freedom. We try to disrupt, normative assumptions of what it means to be African, normative assumptions of what it means to address one's contradictions living in a settler colonial state, right? So we do that, and for me, fortunate enough that the program, is part of the humanities, is part of what we call digital humanities. You can actually find, access to it from the Humanities Center. They have a toolkit. I'm forgetting the name of it. I'm blanking on the name of it. If you go to the Humanities Center website, National Humanities Center website, go to the classroom, you can actually access it there. Or again, for me, it's about access. I make it easy. I make it easy. Just Google Africa World Now Project, and it's there. You can have access to it on every considered to be podcast platform. It comes on live on the radio show. So one of the things that I think that I'm in a tradition, or try to live in a tradition, I am very, very, it's very, very important to me that we situate ourselves in a tradition in order to, number one, please our ancestors, make sure we make our ancestors proud, but also to kind of pick up on the streams and rhythms of thoughts that and activities that they started in order to reach some type of other question, in order to reach some type of conclusion. So I think that it's important really to understand that it is a platform, and we've had and again disrupting what is knowledge, disrupting how do we develop a understanding from the ground up, and meet in the middle. So I spend a lot of time really building that. Spend a lot of time really making sure that it has access, because for me, it may not be appreciated by some now, but we know we have a global audience. but I also am thinking 5, 10, 20, 30 years ahead. I know that this is going to be available, just like in the archives when we have access to, the speeches of Dr. King and hear Marcus Garvey's voice and W.B. Du Bois. When we hear those, particular voices, is because somebody had the foresight to not only write but also to record them. And so Africa, so it's in a tradition of being able to provide a broad range of knowledge. And let me just say this real quick. One of the things that is very, very important to me as well is, how do we organize information? It's one thing to have information, pieces of information, right? It's one thing to know dates. It's one thing to know or to have information. But information, to me, and what I've come to understand, is not knowledge until it's organized for an express purpose. And so once we organize these bits and pieces of information and for an express purpose, whether we're trying to disrupt what it means to be an academic, what it means to be a Black scholar, which generally has been taken over by this idea of a public intellectual, and our Black scholars are people, and please, I don't, I'm writing books, I'm trying to write more books and stuff. I'm not poo-pooing books because I think they're important, but we tend to say that our leaders and our scholars are the ones who write books and be on the New York bestseller list, blah, 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 as opposed to what is the information that they're giving that we can use to organize. Is it leading us to a destination? Is it leading us to an objective? So for me, information properly are organized. Now you can organize it, for an express purpose. And so for me, Africana studies, if we organize our information for the aims and goals and the questions that Africana studies has developed, has presented to us, past, present, then our future looks very, very different, because the answers that we're going to seek, the answers that we're going to attempt to find, attempt to understand based upon the critical questions, as Vincent Harding would say in his piece. That's why, for me, those particular projects are very, very important, because it allows us to think out and loud in public. It allows other people to engage. It allows other people to actually have conversations. And I'll say this one last thing about the programs. One of my most proudest achievements for the program, interestingly enough, is that I've got news that that the program, brothers and sisters who are actually in prison, actually listen to the program, and they hold classes around it. So for me, that is what Africana Studies is attempting to do. How do we really raise the level of conversation and discourse around us, historically, and in a contemporary sense, in order to really realize and really to think about and to use our imaginations to create another future.
So here you are, not only the formal Africana Studies professor inside the classroom, you also have this extensive intellectual practice that extends the classroom, that the classroom is not purely the four walls on the campus community. It is part of the broader community, and that community is global. And you use the media technology of the radio to reach that community. And then, of course, with live streaming. You're now at Winston-Salem State University, the home of Mady Hall Zuma, class of 1937, who really worked to really catalyze and transform the ANC. When you look at the early history of the ANC, particularly in the late 40s and early 50s, she's there, and she comes right out of North Carolina, right out of Winston-Salem State. Mm-hmm. And along with your work, your formal intellectual work, as well as the work that you're doing on the radio program, you're also ensuring that students see this Africana world as director of the Office of International Programs. I know prior to COVID, you were intentional on developing an international program that was intentionally an extension of this Africana understanding. Talk to us about the intellectual design behind that and why you chose the places you choose to visit with students.
Wow, yeah. So it is funny you're asking that question like you weren't involved in, in that question, but from oh, yes, okay. So conversations that we had, when it was very, very important that we both had a shared vision, and I was able to actually be in position and be put into position to really take students on what we would consider to be a decolonizing a journey. And so, when we were thinking about the fact that, how the diaspora, African diaspora was created in all of its manifestations, before slavery, and in particular, we're living in the vestiges of this period of so-called after slavery. It was very important to really decolonize those routes. And so, one of the programs one of the places we go is Cuba. Cuba is considered to be the gateway into the Americas. So it was intentional and important because there's so many obvious, real historical things. We can read about the continuities of Africana history between Cuba, specifically North Carolina. When we talk about Robert F. Williams, Negroes with Guns, and going down to Cuba, we can talk about those things. There's another thing to actually walk in the footsteps of there, to see for yourself the things that people say, whether it's Brazil, whether it's Kenya. And so for me, what was very important is how do we have a robust, textured, very, very clear way of expanding how we produce ways of knowing by engaging in indigenous ways of knowing, meaning that we're going to go to these particular places and talk with people who've lived in these communities from generation after generation. So that within itself takes the Africana Studies intellectual project and really makes it a more robust program, textured program, literally, because we're literally getting on a plane and moving into these particular spaces and decolonizing those treks. One of the things we know in historical instances is that Europeans who wrote a lot about Africa as having no history and those types of things, also most of them didn't even go to Africa. So they were actually using a lot of the stories and the journals and all the other stuff that people who had nefarious intentions on the continent are in not only the continent, but also other places where people of color live. And so we wanted, students take a notebook. Students are taking a journal. And so this journal, that even everything that is designed in the program, from literal the journal to the fact that students are never sent. Well, there are students who can go through our other programs such as ICEPT and those, but if they come in, they can go individually. But our faculty lab programs are engaged in faculty discussions before we leave. It is robust, substantive engagement with the different issues, the different histories, and then we really disrupt those normative assumptions of what people and students have, whether it's Kenya, whether it's Brazil, Salvador Bahia in Brazil, or whether it's Cuba. And so I was, and yes, COVID really did a number on travel. So there was a number of partnerships I was going to solidify. One of them with the Steve Biko Center in Salvador Bahia, which is a community-based educational institution started by young folk who were righteously upset at the education system, developed this community-based educational institution that is now a world class. People come from all over the world to engage and see what the Steve Biko Center is doing in the tradition of Africana studies. When we talk about Africana studies as non-institutional formations, we talk about, you know, the storefronts, the bookstores, the different centers, Malcolm X Liberation College, you know, the attempts that people were attempting to do to build an institution that speaks to the full range of an African humanity for a particular purpose. And that particular purpose was to change the conditions within which African people have found themselves, you know, post-industrial, post so-called slavery. And I keep saying post so-called slavery for, you know, obvious reasons. But the point being is the study abroad program. And also I'll say this, and I've been looking for this video, maybe we could do some type of a collective. There was this video I saw like a long time, a few years ago, and it was a director of Africana studies who said, and also we know a lot of Africana studies in the tradition. Let me also bring this back to, you know, the actual tradition or the intellectual project, is that study abroad or international travel was supposed to be an integral component in the curriculum moving into the academy. And so it also was supposed to be community-based along with institutional based. So we do know that history. So we know that, again, once again, I'm following in a tradition. I'm following and attempting to kind of actualize a number of the ideas and arguments and positions that, you know, folk who were attempting to develop this thing that we call Africana studies now, that goes, you know, that Black studies, Africana studies, African American studies, what they put their lives on the line for. And so for me, it's only right for me to do that. And so the places that we pick, and I'll end it here because I can talk on and on about it, because I love what I do, obviously. And the places are picked in the context of ancestral and historical connections. So what I try to do is I try to make sure the students see themselves in the world. I want to go to places where students can find connections as soon as they get off the plane, find connections, you know, as soon as they spend a day and say, oh my God, like, you know just as many songs, because students say this all the time, especially when we go to Kenya, because they interact with the students. So we have students, Kenyan students at the university who are interacting with our students, and they're with them the entire time. And they're quoting rap lyrics. They're singing songs together, and everybody looking at them like, oh my God, you know the same stuff. So that was important to me, because once we solidify that, then students can move into the world more confidently. They can move into the world with a clear understanding that they know that they have a space in the world, and that they can engage with other cultures and other places more robust and get more out of it, as opposed to being put and thrust into a place that they can't necessarily immediately find a historical and ancestral connection to, and then, you know, that type of thing. So I'll just kind of, you know, leave it there.
So your practice is really to animate and embody the ways in which Africana studies and students in Africana studies are part of a global conversation. Absolutely. And to be part of that is to go and visit those global partners. The idea of continental and diasporic Africans is not just rhetoric, it's reality. It's how knowledge is produced and those interfaces. And it's interesting, you raised the Steve Biko Institute in Salvador Bahia. Today, of course, we remember the murder of Steve Biko in 1977. Today also marks the birth of another revolutionary, Amilcar Cabral, in 1924. So there's a way in which that practice that you continue to do through the Office of International Programs extends Africana in many ways. You see, looking at your practice both from the classroom to the radio, as well as to international programs. In many ways, James, you're building a Black university, an Africana university.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah.
and it's very deliberate. We have about 3 more minutes left. And what I wanted to do is sort of get your thoughts on what do you see as some of the key challenges and key opportunities in Africana studies that we're facing right now here in 2021?
Great question, and I'll keep it short because I usually love to have audience for the conversation as well. The primary challenge actually is, interestingly enough, a political challenge, and also doing something that I say we need to place the Africa back in Africana studies. What I mean is that, this question of the global, this question of the international, is very, very important because it is ahistorical to not be international. It is ahistorical, particularly for people of African descent here in the Americas, but in particular here in the United States, to not have an internationalist point of view, to not be understanding or trying to understand what is happening with our communities on the continent of Africa, our communities in Europe, or communities in the Caribbean or in South America. So with that being said, that is a political question. And as Michael Thewell, we were talking about this in Africana Studies on Friday, or maybe Wednesday last week, is that one of the things that I have seen, and I'm sure we all have seen it, is that in most Africana Studies programs, it is heavily maybe English or maybe something in the cultural, but the politics. We could talk about at some point, maybe there's going to be another conversation. We could really talk about, this split between Black politics and the Council of Black Studies. And, so for me, it's a political question. How do we really have, an intentionality on folk in Africana Studies programs to be engaged in questions that are centered on the political? And I'm not saying that questions of literature, critical engagement with literature, or critical engagement with history and those types of things are not important. But what we see, and if we look at most of the programs and the curriculums, is that one of the things that you find is that there, this notion of the political, this idea of politics. And so it's different for someone to teach a course on politics or say that we're sprinkling politics in my I'm teaching, this is just an example, folk who may be teaching literature, and they're saying, but they're trained in a certain way, not necessarily or their research isn't necessarily interdisciplinary, is that there's still going to be some blind spots. And so the removal or the intentionality in not having, folk who are engaged in specific political questions in these programs is problematic, because it's produced a lot of, quite frankly, empty analysis. Folk who are engaged in questions that are around the issue, as opposed to being prescriptive and descriptive, right? Because, Black politics does two things at once. People have just basically made choices and say, we're going to do this one thing. And, as some people say, we just want to do one thing well, so, but that begs to be determined and assessed as well, if that one thing they are doing well. So Africa will be the last thing, a real inclusion on indigenous forms and ways of being from the continent of Africa, being centered or being primary in Africana studies as well.
Well, James, I think you've given us a lot tonight, and I really want to thank you for it. And that vision of a very global vision is necessary, given our contemporary moment, bisected as it is both by a pandemic and by the very calamitous future that we all face, the future of organized human life, given the reality that we're burning the atmosphere And the climate change is not something that is coming, it is here, and it confronts us globally. So I want to thank you for that, and thank you for that challenge, but thank you as well for this wonderful conversation and for allowing us to get to know you, your project, as well as how you've engaged in a systematic study of Africana studies across your terrain. And I remember when you first came to Winston-Salem State, you wowed some of the faculty who were basketball players with your skills in Reed Center. They just didn't know you were the man at Chehaw Station.
Yeah, right. I'm unassuming, and I see we you know, when I saw our good friend and great scholar Kadrina Harold, and I got intimidated very quickly because I'm like, oh my goodness, I got to step up. But yeah, you know, because of course, you know, basketball is something that she's very familiar with as well. So, but yeah, so.
I want to thank you and thank everyone for joining us. Next week, we'll have conversations in Black Studies with Ed Whitfield, the class of 1970 from Cornell University. Many of you know him from that striking Pulitzer Prize winning photo of the students walking out of Straight Hall on the campus of Cornell University. But Ed Whitfield came down to Greensboro, North Carolina in 1970 when he graduated, and worked at Malcolm X Liberation University and stayed in Greensboro and has done some phenomenal work in Greensboro. So we're excited next week to welcome Ed Whitfield. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.